Winter comes early where I live, a high-ridge town that treats October like January and tests a person's honesty with the cold. Preparation isn't a hobby here, it's a creed, and I'd spent 3 straight weekends feeding that creed, felling, bucking, splitting, until a cathedral of oak and fir rose behind my cabin like a promise I could touch. The morning I stepped outside to breathe steam into the air and admire the stacked proof of my discipline, the promise was gone. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Silence will tell you more than shouting ever does. I didn't curse, I didn't flail. I crouched and studied the evidence like a range card. Boot treads in hoarfrost, crushed bark, 2 parallel scars in the dirt, where a sled or cheap dolly had dragged weight across the property line. The tracks didn't meander. They marched, clean and arrogant, straight toward the only house around here painted the color of entitlement. HOA Karen's place. 52, hair-sprayed helmet, clipboard welded to her palm, and a smile that always arrived a half-second before a fine. I followed the drag marks through rime-silvered grass and across the boundary stake she'd tried to reinterpret twice at meetings. My breath came out in steady clouds, not from rage. Rage makes you sloppy, but from the kind of cold that respects no one. And there it was, my winter, restacked behind her perfect beige palace like a trophy. Same split faces, same lengths I cut to fit my wood burner. My initials burned into a few ends with a branding iron I made in the shop. She hadn't even bothered to turn those to the wall. Karen was already waiting, chin angled, arms folded so tight the clipboard looked like a shield. "Good morning, Cole," she sang, voice dipped in artificial sweetener. "You had an unsightly heap of combustible material on your lot. Per Regulation 12.4, I relocated it for community safety and pest mitigation." "Relocated," I said. The word tasted like rust. "Not stole." "Words matter," she replied, smile sharpening. "And the regulations are clear. Outdoor storage must be screened. You failed to file a concealment plan. I took corrective action. You're welcome." I stepped closer until I could smell the perfume she used to cover the scent of fear and hairspray. "Those logs are mine, my land, my labor, my heart." She flicked her eyes to the stack, then back to me like a referee who'd already decided the score. "Your feelings don't override community standards," she said. "This neighborhood isn't a logging camp. Some of us have property values to protect." Out here, property value is staying alive when the barometer drops like a stone and wind carves the ridge into a knife. Out here, form follows fire. I let the silence stretch until I felt her start to mistake it for surrender. People like Karen confuse stillness with weakness. That's their first mistake. "You filed a report, of course," I said, as if we were being reasonable. "You logged the chain of custody, photographed the boundary stakes, got signatures. You know, things people do when they aren't trespassing." A flicker crossed her eyes. "Board business is confidential." "Convenient," I said. "So is theft when you print your own badge." Her smile cracked, just a hair. "If you persist in this attitude," she said, "there will be fines, non-compliance penalties, and if you escalate, legal action. I have counsel." "I have winter," I said, and left her standing in her curated gravel while the mountain wind ruffled her robe of authority like a cheap costume. Back at the cabin, the empty cradle behind the woodshed looked indecent, like a bed someone stripped in a hurry. I checked the backup rack under the eaves, half a face cord of spruce I ration for shoulder days, and the propane heater I keep as a stopgap. Protocol, not paranoia. My hands knew how to inventory without the rest of me wasting heat on anger. In another life, I'd been U.S. Army, combat engineer, where you learn that systems beat speeches and discipline outlasts noise. This wasn't my first winter, or my first petty tyrant in an ill-fitting uniform. The forecast radioed its warning in the clipped voice of a weatherman who didn't exaggerate. Cold front descending, pressure falling, storm window opening in 36 hours. I sharpened steel and tightened routines. In the mirror, a man looked back who could pass for mid-40s, a couple scars where the job put them, and the kind of gaze that makes bullies look at their shoes. I ate, I hydrated, I checked the seals on the generator and the stabilizer in the fuel. I wanted my anger to settle like silt in a jar. Let gravity pull it down until the water ran clear. Clarity is what keeps you from making expensive mistakes. Across the draw, a puff of chimney smoke smudged the sky over Karen's vanilla castle. She'd started early. Of course she had. People who steal labor love to spend it fast. I imagined her tossing whole rounds into a cold fireplace and wondering why they sulked instead of burned. Fire takes tending. It requires bed coals, draft, patience, the discipline to feed it slow and steady. Fire is a relationship, not a vending machine. She wouldn't know that. Karen thought heat was something you demanded with the right letterhead. As the light thinned, the ridge shouldered against a bank of iron cloud. Needles whispered, and then tightened. The air got that metallic taste that precedes snowfall by an hour. I buttoned up exterior vents, stowed them all, and ran a gloved hand over the empty bays where my oak should have slept out the winter. The anger rose again, then receded like a tide I refused to obey. Emotions were welcome here only if they paid rent. The first flakes came fat and deliberate, auditioning for the whiteout behind them. The generator coughed, caught, settled into a steady hum that felt like a heartbeat in the floorboards. The propane heater clicked and sighed alive, a reserve unit to take the edge off while I figured whether to burn the spruce tonight or hold it. I stood at the window and watched the street disappear under a white eraser. The mountain was closing its book. Somewhere under that new silence sat a stolen woodpile beside a woman who believed the cold, respected forms. She hadn't learned what I learned long ago in places colder than this, under skies less forgiving. Winter is the last honest judge. It doesn't debate. It doesn't negotiate. It weighs your preparation, the chords you stacked, the systems you tested, the respect you paid to physics, and it renders a verdict without ceremony. Karen had filed her briefs on pastel paper. The storm didn't read pastel. At full dark, the wind found its stride and ran it like a marathoner, steady and merciless. Trees bowed, then held, snow braided in sheets like blown silk. Across the way, her chimney smoked too hard, wasteful, then thinned to a thread. She'd fed the fire like a grudge, all at once, all emotion, no plan. The thread snapped. The chimney went black. Lights blinked. Then nothing. I poured coffee and let it steam under my nose, watching glaze crawl over her gutters. My fingers itched to go out there and repossess what was mine by law and sweat, to haul it home in the storm and dare her to lift a mitten. But storms don't care who starts fights. They only care who finishes preparedness. I set the mug down and listened to the generator's faithful purr. Patience, Harrington. The cold does your talking for you. Midnight marked itself not with clocks, but with the knock, a frantic, raw-fisted pounding that rattled the latch like a trapped bird. I opened the door to a silhouette rimmed in driven snow. Karen. Hair collapsed, mascara smudged into raccoon brackets, skin the color of bad milk. The clipboard was gone. So was the smile. "My heat," she gasped, words chipping against her teeth. "The wood, it's gone, it burned so fast Behind her, the storm shoved a shoulder into the porch and tried to come in. I stood aside just far enough to make a point and no farther. "Mind the threshold," I said. "Ice'll lay you out." She stumbled across, hugging herself like a penitent before an altar. The propane heater breathed a little life back into her face. She stuck both hands toward it, as if proximity could erase bad decisions. "You took a winter and tried to spend it in an afternoon," I said. Not accusing, just the report of facts. "The mountain doesn't take IOUs." Her eyes met mine and finally showed something other than disdain. Comprehension, the kind that arrives only after pride has been frostbitten. "I didn't know," she said, voice small. I thought it would be fine." "Rules don't keep a fire," I said. "Tending does." I let the silence fill, again, not to punish, but to measure. Outside, a branch cracked like a rifle report. The house shivered and settled its weight as if bracing. Somewhere down the hill, a transformer popped, and the world went darker. In here, the generator held. In here, systems worked because they'd been earned. This is where stories like to promise revenge and stunts. I prefer outcomes. She would learn. The storm would see to that. And by the time morning peeled night off the ridge, she would understand the difference between authority printed on paper and authority won with preparation, discipline, and respect for the cold. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, what the board didn't know, what anyone who hides behind bylaws never seems to know, is that winter keeps score. And it was about to balance the books. When I came back from the service, I didn't retire. I just changed uniforms. Some people trade rifles for pens. I traded mine for regulations, disaster logistics, and the quiet hum of federal paperwork that decides who lives comfortably and who freezes. I worked a decade with FEMA, writing response protocols for regions that believed cold fronts were harmless until they buried towns alive. I know what a single unplanned night without heat does to the human body. How skin stiffens, how fingers lose their grip, how panic always arrives before frostbite. That's why I moved here to the mountains of Iron Creek, to live on my own terms, where a man's readiness is the only law that matters. When I bought this cabin, it wasn't for luxury. It was penance. I wanted silence. Silence that didn't involve briefing rooms or body counts. I built this place log by log, every nail a promise to live deliberate and disciplined. The locals respected that. Most of them did, anyway. But then came Karen Whitmore, the self-crowned empress of the Iron Creek Homeowners Association. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. Karen didn't build this place. She inherited it through a divorce settlement from a corporate lawyer who couldn't stomach her ego anymore. And yet, she strutted around like the HOA bylaws were scripture, and she was the high priest. She wasn't enforcing order, she was enforcing worship, the kind that demands obedience just to remind you she exists. She'd show up uninvited at people's doors, quoting subsection numbers like a preacher quotes psalms. Section 8.2, no unregistered vehicles. Article 5, trash bins must be screened. But behind that perfect hair and performative smile was a kind of hunger I've seen before. The kind I used to see in insurgents who believed control justified cruelty. The first time we spoke, she tried to fine me for stacking sandbags too close to the creek bed. "Visual obstruction," she said. I told her it was flood mitigation per County Regulation 42C. She didn't like that I spoke her language better than she did. She didn't like that I cited law instead of begging permission. That was when the quiet war began. The kind that doesn't use bullets, just bureaucracy. She'd lose community notices on my behalf. Double my HOA dues on clerical errors. Claim my truck was parked half an inch past the concrete boundary. Each time, I responded in writing. Calm, concise, citing chapter and code, always CCing the county compliance board. It drove her insane. HOA tyrants feed on fear and chaos. They starve when you answer them with discipline. But she never forgot that humiliation. That's why she took my firewood. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. I learned a long time ago that bullies don't understand negotiation. They understand consequences. But you can't teach consequences through anger. You teach them through patience, through exposure, through letting nature take their mask off piece by piece. And nature doesn't need permission slips. By the second night of that storm, power lines were sagging under ice, tree limbs were breaking like gunshots, and the temperature was sinking into single digits. The kind of cold that makes wood sound like it's breathing. Karen had her fancy thermostat, her imported cashmere, and her moral superiority, none of which burn at 30 below. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and studied the firelight dancing across my floorboards. Every flicker was a reminder that preparation is justice. You don't file for it, you earn it. I'd learned that the hard way years ago in Alaska, coordinating emergency relief for a rural village where supply lines froze over. We lost 3 houses, 1 life, all because someone thought guidelines mattered more than instincts. That memory never left me. Neither did the guilt. Maybe that's why I didn't slam the door on Karen when she came shivering to mine. Not mercy, just memory. She sat by the heater, clutching the mug I gave her like it was her last prayer. "How do you do it?" she finally asked, voice breaking between shivers. "How do you live like this, so far from everything with nothing?" "Nothing," I said, glancing around at the cabin. The walls I'd milled myself, the shelves stocked with supplies, the systems calibrated and maintained. "Out here, nothing keeps you alive." She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "You make it sound like war." "It is," I said, "just slower. Out here the enemy doesn't wear a uniform, it wears weather." Her eyes darted to the window, where the snow was thick as fog and howling like it had a soul. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The mountain was already giving her the sermon she'd refused to hear from me. That night, I stoked the fire low and steady, fed it like a heartbeat. 3 logs, then rest. Karen watched every move, her usual authority stripped bare by exhaustion. I told her to sleep near the warmth. She obeyed without argument. The storm outside clawed at the roof, but in that cabin, control finally belonged to something purer. Balance, discipline, survival. I stayed up, not from mistrust, but from habit. You don't turn your back on the elements or on people who underestimate them. My mind drifted back to Iraq, to an outpost where we lost heat during a sudden sandstorm. Different climate, same principle. 1 generator offline, and comfort turns to chaos in under an hour. I remembered my CO's words. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's respect for reality. Karen had built her whole life pretending reality could be managed by minutes and memos. Tonight, she was learning otherwise. When the first pale light of dawn cracked through the snow-caked window, I saw it in her eyes. Recognition. Not gratitude, not yet, but recognition of power she couldn't legislate. She looked small, and for the first time, human. "Cole," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. Sorry, it doesn't change temperature. Sorry doesn't bring back wood or pride. But it's the only currency people like her have when the world stops caring about their rules." I nodded once, enough to let her keep her dignity, and poured more coffee. What most folks don't understand about survival is that it's not just about gear or grit. It's about perspective. It's about knowing that the world doesn't owe you a single degree of warmth. Every calorie of heat is earned. Every breath in a blizzard is a victory. And every time you think you're above nature, nature files that memory away for later correction. Karen would leave my cabin eventually. People like her always do. They rebuild their arrogance as soon as they're safe. But she'd never forget that night. Because for once, she had to depend on a man she'd tried to fine into submission. For once, her clipboard couldn't save her. I didn't gloat. That's not my nature. I just watched the mountain and let it teach its lesson. The same one I learned 20 years ago under a different flag, in a different uniform, but under the same sky. You don't beat nature. You cooperate or you perish. And those who try to rule it, they always end up on the wrong side of the frost. When the storm finally broke, the mountain exhaled steam like a beast cooling its rage. Snow stacked against the porch rails, glittering under a pale sun that looked more like mercy than warmth. Karen was still wrapped in the blanket I'd given her, staring into the dying fire as if it were a confession booth. She hadn't said much since dawn, just sat there quietly, humbled. But humility doesn't last long in people like her. It's temporary frost, melts the moment comfort returns. By mid-morning, she found her voice again. "You should have stored that wood properly," she said, attempting to reconstruct her old tone, though it trembled between words. None of this would have happened. I didn't even look up from the axe I was sharpening. "You mean if I'd stored it where you couldn't steal it?" Her mouth opened, then closed, no comeback ready. That silence, that 2-second hesitation, told me she wasn't just careless. She was defensive. Guilt always reveals itself in self-justification. And when someone like Karen defends too fast, it's because there's more beneath the surface. When she finally left, bundled tight and ashamed, I watched her walk back to her house. Her footprints vanished in the new snow within minutes. The mountain erases arrogance fast. But her behavior had scratched at something in my mind. Something administrative, procedural. HOA Karens like her don't operate solo. They need a system to hide behind. Bureaucracy isn't just her armor, it's her weapon. That night, I pulled out the HOA bylaws, a thick binder every resident received but few ever read. I'd skimmed it before, but now I dissected it like a case file. Every clause, every subpoint, every signature line. And buried inside, in Section 14.8, Discretionary Enforcement Authority, was the cancer. It granted the HOA president autonomous judgment to enforce compliance and impose corrective measures without prior board approval in cases deemed urgent. That one phrase, deemed urgent, was the loophole she used to justify theft, intimidation, and control. I cross-referenced that clause with meeting minutes stored in the public HOA archive, because people like Karen always underestimate who reads the fine print. I found pattern after pattern. Property disputes resolved in her favor. Noise complaints dismissed when they came from her allies. Late fees waived for her friends on the board. And the strangest part? Every check written for community maintenance, snowplow contracts, landscaping, waste removal, led back to the same P.O. box in town registered under a shell company, Whitmore Management and Consulting. Her name, her pocket, her fraud. I'd seen this before. In the federal field, it's called self-dealing, the quiet siphoning of trust into personal gain. On paper, it looks like efficiency. In practice, it's corruption hiding behind compliance. But HOA corruption hits differently. It isn't just financial, it's psychological. These aren't officials in suits. They're neighbors with power and no oversight. They don't just drain bank accounts, they drain dignity. Karen ruled Iron Creek like a petty monarch, dictating what color mailboxes could be, how tall fences could stand, and who deserved to feel welcome. The firewood theft wasn't an exception. It was a continuation of her pattern. She didn't steal for survival. She stole because she could. I began quietly interviewing other residents, disguised as friendly post-storm welfare checks. Old Tom from Lot 14, said Karen fined him $250 for leaving his truck tires on bare gravel. Denise from Lot 22 mentioned she once got a warning letter for hanging a wind chime that disturbed community serenity. A young couple from Lot 9 told me Karen made them repaint their door twice because burgundy isn't an approved neutral. Every story followed the same blueprint. Small power plays, dressed as neighborhood order, feeding her ego one rule at a time. It didn't take long before someone slipped me the ledger. Not the sanitized one she presented at annual meetings. The real one, the handwritten version with corrections and redactions. There, in ink smudges and crossed-out numbers, the pattern screamed louder than any witness could. She'd been pocketing community funds for 3 years, falsifying contractor invoices, doubling repair costs, and redirecting balances into accounts under her name. Every dollar stolen was disguised as beautification, compliance inspections, or emergency preparedness. Ironically, the only emergency she ever prepared for was her own greed. I took photos, logged entries, time-stamped everything. I knew better than to confront her immediately. Timing was ammunition. She'd dig her own grave deeper if she didn't know I was watching. A few days later, I spotted her back in her element, clipboard in hand, smile restored, parading through the cul-de-sac like the storm had never happened. People nodded politely but avoided eye contact. That's how she thrived, through polite fear. But that fear was fading. The storm had broken more than ice. It had broken illusions. Neighbors saw her differently now, the woman who nearly froze because she stole survival from someone else. She stopped at my mailbox, probably hoping to reassert dominance. "Cole," she said with that sugar-coated venom, "there'll be an HOA meeting this Friday. Attendance is mandatory." "Good," I said. "I've got a few agenda items of my own." Her smile twitched, not from curiosity but from instinct. Predators can smell when the prey isn't afraid anymore. She turned briskly and walked off, her boots crunching through snow that hid more than footprints. It hid change. That week, I went full federal. I drafted a report, formatted like the incident files I used to submit during disaster fraud investigations. Everything sourced, dated, verified. I included her shell company registration, the financial discrepancies, the testimonies, the bylaws she'd weaponized, and the state statute numbers she violated. People think revenge is emotion. It isn't. It's paperwork, accuracy, and timing. The kind of revenge that doesn't just sting, it dismantles. Friday came. The community hall filled slowly, a mix of reluctant homeowners, retirees, and young families. The air was stale with polite discomfort. Karen stood at the front, pearls glinting under fluorescent light, smiling like a governor about to give a victory speech. "Let's begin," she said, gavel tapping. "First item, winter preparedness protocol." That's when I stood up. Calm. Precise. Every move rehearsed. "Before you continue," I said, "I'd like to submit an emergency motion for board review." She frowned. "This isn't the appropriate—" "Per Section 7.1, Subclause D," I interrupted. "Any resident presenting material evidence of financial misconduct has the right to immediate hearing. I'm invoking that clause." The room went still. Karen's eyes flicked toward her allies, but no one moved. She was alone, surrounded by the people she'd bullied into silence. I handed my binder to the vice president of the board. "Everything's there," I said. "Every transaction, every violation, every forged signature. And if you think it's just a misunderstanding, the county registrar and the state audit office already have duplicates." The vice president flipped through the pages. Her face paled. Karen tried to laugh, the sound brittle. "This is absurd. You can't just—" "I can," I said. because you taught me the rules better than anyone, and I've played by them every step of the way." That was the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. Not the fear of cold, the fear of exposure. The kind that strips away not comfort, but control. What they didn't know, what Karen didn't know, was that I'd already sent everything to the state's Attorney General's office under the Community Oversight Division. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need revenge theatrics. The system she worshipped was about to devour her whole. When I left that meeting, the sky was clear and sharp as glass. The mountain was quiet again. The storm outside was over, but the one inside Iron Creek was just beginning. When I left that meeting, Karen's empire was already collapsing. She just didn't know it yet. The kind of downfall she'd orchestrated for others was finally on her calendar, stamped in ink she couldn't erase. My report was no rant. It was a technical dossier, a hammer disguised as paperwork. Years in FEMA and judicial coordination had taught me that power isn't loud. It's documented. The next morning I drove down to the county seat, tires crunching through frost as dawn split the horizon in pale gold. I walked straight into the Office of Regulatory Compliance. The clerk behind the counter, a young man with a badge that still shined, asked for ID. I handed him my federal credentials. They weren't expired. I still carried advisory clearance. The moment he saw the seal, his posture straightened. That's the beauty of authority. It doesn't beg, it compels. "I need to file a misconduct escalation under State Housing Ordinance 215, I said. "Individual or board violation?" he asked. "Both," I replied, "and it involves an HOA president using discretionary authority to self-allocate community funds." He raised an eyebrow. "We've been getting a few complaints from Iron Creek lately." "Then you'll want this," I said, setting down my binder. "This isn't rumor, it's structured evidence, transactional, logs, county discrepancies, and 2 sets of conflicting financial trails, one digital, one handwritten." He scanned the first few pages, his lips tightening as he read. "This is solid," he murmured. "How long's she been running this?" "Long enough to think she was untouchable," I said. "That's how investigations begin, not with sirens, but with silence. A single signature can unravel an empire. Within 24 hours, a case number was assigned. CRO 2741IC, Iron Creek Financial Mismanagement. It wasn't federal yet, but it would be. Fraud in a community association that crosses state reimbursement funds for infrastructure automatically triggers federal review. I knew exactly which wire to pull next. I called in an old contact, Special Agent Porter, Department of Housing and Urban Development Inspector General's office. We'd worked side by side during post-disaster fraud audits after the Colorado wildfires. He owed me a favor. When he picked up, his voice carried the same gravel it always had. "Cole? Hell, I thought you'd hung up your badge for good." "I tried," I said, "but corruption doesn't retire, and neither do I." He chuckled. "What's the case?" "Small-town HOA president using shell companies for self-contracting. Local board's too scared to act." "Name?" "Karen Whitmore." There was a pause. "Whitmore. That name sounds familiar." "It should," I said. "She used to run a property management firm in Boulder, got fined for falsified maintenance reports back in 2017. That confirmed what I already suspected. Karen's HOA reign wasn't her first act. It was a continuation of a career built on manipulation. I emailed Porter the full file. Within hours, he looped in a compliance attorney and a financial analyst. 3 layers of oversight locked onto her like radar. Meanwhile, in Iron Creek, the cracks were spreading. Neighbors whispered about missing funds, delayed snowplow payments, and double-charged community fees. Her loyalists began jumping ship, quietly distancing themselves. HOA power isn't built on structure. It's built on perception. And once fear turns to laughter, the tyrant's throne collapses. But Karen fought back. Oh, she tried. The next morning, she slid a notice under my door. violation, unauthorized use of property for storage of hazardous tools. It referred to my acts, petty, desperate, predictable, the kind of move cornered predators make before they bite. I smiled, folded the notice, and stapled it to my own report copy. Exhibit J. 3 days later, the state audit team rolled into town in unmarked SUVs. They didn't announce themselves. They never do. They met at the community center, flashing badges, collecting statements, photographing ledgers. Karen's castle was under siege, and she didn't even know which gate they'd entered through. That evening, I got a call from Porter. "You weren't exaggerating," he said. "We cross-referenced her shell company with tax filings. She's been routing HOA payments through a dummy contractor and reporting them as snow-clearing expenses." "How much?" I asked. "Estimates 48 grand over 3 years. Maybe more. She's cooked invoices, falsified signatures, and altered timestamps. We're talking full-scale mail fraud and tax evasion if it checks out federally." "Then it's not an HOA issue anymore," I said. "It's a criminal one." "Exactly," Porter replied, "and your documentation makes it airtight." He wasn't wrong. Every timestamp I logged, every check image I scanned, became a nail in her coffin. That's the irony. Karen believed she was insulated by rules. She didn't realize rules are a two-edged sword. You can weaponize them, but the sharpest edge always cuts upward. By the week's end, she started sensing something was off. Her emails bounced. Her access to the HOA's online banking froze for verification. The vendors she'd paid began getting calls from auditors, and when the mailman stopped by her porch with certified letters stamped "official notice," I knew the dominoes were falling. I stood on my porch that night, coffee steaming in the cold, watching her house from a distance. The light inside flickered, not candlelight but panic. She paced near the window, phone pressed to her ear, voice rising even through glass. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the language: denial, anger, bargaining, the classic steps of collapse. But I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I'd seen this pattern too many times before, power devouring itself. It's a law older than any statute. Those who build their thrones on other people's suffering always drown in their own rules. Still, part of me wondered how deep it went. Fraud rarely lives alone. It breeds accomplices. So I dug deeper. County records showed a name repeatedly connected to hers: Councilman Gerald Denton, the same official who approved HOA variance permits for neighborhood zoning. I checked his donation logs. 3 contributions from Whitmore Management. The puzzle fit too neatly. Corruption wasn't isolated. It was systemic. I passed everything to Porter. He didn't hesitate. "We'll escalate to the U.S. Attorney's office," he said. "You might get a call for a statement." "I'll be ready," I told him. That night, Iron Creek slept beneath a hard frost. The same frost that had nearly killed Karen now guarded her evidence like a vault. Nature has a way of preserving things: footprints, mistakes, truth. When the subpoena came 2 weeks later, it wasn't a surprise. The HOA was officially under federal investigation. Karen's name appeared first on the list, followed by 3 board members and 1 local contractor. Charges pending: wire fraud, misappropriation of community funds, falsified documentation, and tax evasion. Word spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. Residents who'd once bowed their heads when she passed now stared openly, some whispering, others laughing. The empire of fear had become a circus of consequence. Karen tried one last move, a community emergency meeting to defend herself. She stood at the podium, trembling, trying to spin it as political targeting. But every face in that room was colder than the mountain air. Her words landed like stones dropped into ice. When she locked eyes with me in the back row, she saw it. Not revenge, not triumph, just inevitability. "You did this," she spat. "No," I said. "You did. I just wrote it down." That's what people like her never understand. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, documents, and waits. And when it moves, it's unstoppable. The next morning, black sedans arrived. 2 agents in long coats escorted her out of her pristine porch, past the same mailbox she'd once used to deliver her threats. Cameras clicked. Neighbors watched from their windows. The mountain was silent, but justice was loud. I watched from my porch. Same coffee, same calm. It wasn't the satisfaction I felt. It was symmetrical. The system she'd twisted was now turning, grinding through her lies, line by line, form by form. You can't cheat the structure forever. Not when someone who built it decides to pull the bolts out. That night, the fire in my cabin burned steadily. Outside, the snow fell soft and quiet again, covering the footprints left by the agents. The mountain had reset itself, clean, balanced, unforgiving. And somewhere in a detention cell, HOA Karen was learning what real regulation felt like. The morning after her arrest, Iron Creek woke to a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt stunned, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The headlines spread faster than the wind. HOA president faces federal fraud charges. Her mugshot was everywhere. Local news, regional bulletins, even a federal press release. The same woman who once fined people for chipped mailboxes was now photographed under fluorescent lights, her pearls gone, her pride stripped bare. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. The community was buzzing. For years, Karen had ruled with fear disguised as order. But fear, once exposed, turns to ridicule. Neighbors who once whispered about her now laughed over coffee. Kids sledded down the hill outside her house, the same hill she'd once labeled unsafe for recreational use. It was poetic. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I've seen too many investigations fall apart at the edge of technicalities. Justice isn't victory until the ink dries. So while the town gossiped, I prepared. I spent that afternoon reviewing the case documents HUD's office had sent me, deposition outlines, evidentiary summaries, and subpoena lists. Karen's assets were frozen pending review. Her house, her accounts, even her car, the same luxury SUV she once flaunted in every board meeting, all under federal hold. Her allies? Vanished. People like that never stand in the light when their shadow's gone. But the real confrontation wasn't on paper. It was in person. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to testify at the preliminary hearing. It wasn't in some polished federal courthouse, but in the modest county justice center. The same one I'd visited countless times as part of FEMA logistics reviews, only this time I wasn't behind a desk. I was the witness. When I entered, Karen was already there, seated beside her attorney, a pale man in a gray suit who looked like he'd aged overnight. She turned as I walked in. That look, it wasn't rage. It was recognition, the kind a storm gives the man who predicted it. The judge called the room to order. State versus Karen Whitmore, docket 117B. Her lawyer rose, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, my client wishes to enter a plea of not guilty. The prosecutor didn't flinch. Noted. The evidence packet, however, suggests otherwise. Then came my name. I took the stand, raised my hand, swore the oath. It's strange, swearing to tell the truth when truth is the very thing that's already been weaponized. But I meant every word. The prosecutor began. Mr. Harrington, could you describe your professional background? Former Army Ranger, I said. Later, Senior Federal Emergency Management Liaison, retired after 15 years in federal service. Were you familiar with the HOA's financial operations prior to this case? I became familiar when irregularities surfaced after a storm incident. I documented everything, with timestamps, ledger copies, and photographic proof. Karen's attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge waved him down. Proceed. I outlined every detail: the fake shell company, the inflated invoices, the manipulated board minutes. Each fact landed like a nail in a coffin. The courtroom was dead silent except for the scratch of the stenographer's keys. When I finished, the prosecutor asked the last question. Mr. Harrington, in your professional opinion, was this pattern of misconduct accidental? I looked straight at Karen. No, I said. It was designed. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Karen looked down, not out of shame, but calculation. She was already searching for her next move, some loophole or sob story to manipulate public opinion. I knew that look too well. People like her don't repent. They regroup. Sure enough, by evening, her lawyer released a statement claiming she was a victim of systemic misunderstanding and had always acted in the neighborhood's best interest. The audacity almost impressed me, but it didn't matter. The truth was already out. Within 48 hours, the story went national. HOA corruption wasn't just local gossip. Anymore, it became a case study in overreach and abuse of power. News outlets spun headlines like wildfire. The HOA dictator who fell to her own rules. From regulations to handcuffs, the fall of Karen Whitmore. And then came the interviews. Residents went on record describing her years of tyranny. Old Tom from Lot 14 held up one of her violation letters on camera, laughing. She fined me for painting my shed 2 shades darker than regulation beige, he said. Guess beige doesn't save you from prison. It was poetic justice, the kind that doesn't need music. The silence says enough. But even as her trial neared, she wasn't done. One night, around 10 p.m., headlights flashed across my cabin window. A car stopped at the gate. For a moment, I thought it was another agent, until I saw the figure step out. Karen. Her hair was messy, her posture shaking, but her eyes still had that spark, the kind that refuses to die even when it should. I opened the door before she could knock. You're not supposed to be here, I said. I know, she replied, but I needed to say it to your face. Say what? That you ruined me. I didn't respond. The snow crunched between us, the wind whispering like the mountain itself was eavesdropping. You could have left it alone, she hissed. You could have just let you keep stealing from people who trusted you. I cut her off. You call that justice? It was management, she snapped. Someone had to keep order. These people, they don't appreciate structure. Structure? I laughed quietly. You mean control. You didn't build this place, Karen. You just wanted to own it. She took a step closer, tears freezing against her skin. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything. I met her eyes. I understand exactly. I've seen men lose more than everything, and still not destroy others to feel powerful. For the first time, she had no comeback. Just silence and the faint sound of the storm returning in the distance. I finally said, Go home, Karen. The law will finish what nature started. She turned, stumbled toward her car, and drove off into the cold, the taillights fading like embers dying in snow. The next morning I got the call. She'd violated her release terms by contacting a witness. Me. The marshals picked her up before sunrise. When they cuffed her this time, there were no cameras, no neighbors, just the cold and the same mountain that had witnessed everything from the start. That's the truth about justice. It doesn't scream. It waits. It lets arrogance walk itself into a trap, then closes the gate gently, almost mercifully. As for Iron Creek, things changed. The HOA board dissolved under state supervision. A new charter formed, one based on transparency and community voting. No presidents, no power brokers, just neighbors rebuilding trust one winter at a time. Sometimes I'd see smoke rising from new chimneys, kids playing where Karen's safety signs used to stand. And every time I saw it, I knew. Order had finally been restored. Not by fear, not by fines, but by accountability. Karen's trial ended months later. Guilty. 5 counts of fraud, 2 of falsification, and 1 of harassment. Sentence: 8 years. Federal facility. She'd have plenty of time to think. Not that people like her ever do, but the mountain remembers. It always does. That winter, the snow came early again. I split new logs, stacked them higher than before, the rhythmic sound echoing like a heartbeat in the still air. The fire roared bright that night, not just from wood, but from balance. Justice, restored in flame and frost alike. And somewhere deep in that same storm, I swear I could almost hear her voice carried on the wind, faint, defiant, and fading. The echo of control finally swallowed by the cold she once mocked. Because in the end, the mountain always wins. Justice doesn't end when the gavel drops. It begins there, in the silence afterward, when systems have to rebuild themselves from the wreckage of arrogance. Karen's sentence wasn't the end of this story. It was the trigger for what came next. In the weeks after her conviction, Iron Creek looked like a town emerging from hibernation. The snow thawed, roofs dripped, and the same neighbors she used to bully began meeting again, this time without fear, without the clipboard queen breathing down their necks. But while they rebuilt, I wasn't done. Karen had been a symptom. The disease was the structure that allowed her to exist. The bylaws, the unchecked powers, the lack of oversight. And that was my next mission. I spent my mornings at the cabin, coffee steaming beside a stack of documents, the same axe I used for splitting wood resting against the wall. My federal training wasn't just about logistics or law, it was about systems analysis, how power flows, how it's abused, and how to choke corruption at the root. That's exactly what I did. I drafted a proposal. Not emotional, not personal, just mechanical justice written in ink. I titled it the Community Accountability Reform Act. It targeted the loopholes HOAs had exploited for decades: discretionary enforcement clauses, financial opacity, unmonitored fines. I built it with surgical detail. Every section began the same way. To prevent the consolidation of unregulated authority, I cited case studies, from Iron Creek to similar HOA collapses nationwide. I added data. 67% of local property owner associations in the U.S. operate with no external audit requirements. 42% of them have no democratic election enforcement clause. 18% reported some form of internal misconduct in the last 5 years. Facts don't shout. They build empires of credibility. When I finished, the document was 184 pages long, airtight, formatted to federal submission standards. I sent it to 3 places: the State Legislative Review Board, the Department of Housing Oversight, and my old contact at HUD's Policy Advisory Division, Special Agent Porter. He called me the next day. "Cole, you're not playing small this time." "No," I said. Karen wasn't an isolated storm. She was climate. He whistled softly. "You're trying to rewrite the weather." "Some storms need laws to stop them," I replied. A month later, I was invited to testify before a federal subcommittee reviewing HOA misconduct across multiple states. I wore the same black suit I'd used in judicial ceremonies years ago. The nameplate on the panel read, "David Cole Harrington, former federal liaison, HOA accountability advocate." Titles never mattered to me before. That one did. The hearing room smelled of coffee and cold metal. Cameras lined the back wall. Representatives shuffled papers, bored, until I spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady, "you don't know HOA corruption until you've seen it from the inside. It doesn't come with sirens or headlines. It comes with fines in mailboxes, intimidation at community meetings, and small-town tyrants hiding behind the phrase association policy. I paused, letting silence cut through the noise. I watched a woman in Iron Creek weaponize rules until they became chains. She stole not just money, but security, peace, trust. And when confronted, she invoked procedure like a shield. But rules without oversight aren't laws. They're tools for cowards. Cameras clicked. Committee members straightened. I could see their posture shift, interest sharpening into focus. My proposal doesn't dismantle HOAs, I continued. It regulates them. It installs transparency, public budgets, election verification, quarterly audits. It makes discretionary enforcement illegal, unless approved by majority vote and recorded in state registries. You can't fix corruption with punishment alone. You fix it by removing the darkness it hides in. The chairman leaned forward. Mr. Harrington, how long have you been working on this? Technically, I said, since the day my firewood was stolen. The room chuckled softly, but I didn't. That theft was more than property. It was principle, and it led to a discovery of systematic fraud. One small act of arrogance exposed an entire model of corruption. This isn't revenge, it's reform. When I finished, they didn't applaud. They just nodded, that quiet kind of respect that only comes from truth delivered without performance. By the next session, my proposal had a bill number, HR 2114, the HOA Transparency and Equity Act. It wasn't law yet, but it was real. Drafted, circulated, signed by 2 co-sponsors. That was more satisfying than any punishment could ever be. While legislation churned, Iron Creek kept healing. The new community council met bi-weekly. No hierarchy, no president, just residents taking turns moderating. The bylaws I'd once dissected were rewritten with public input. The clause that gave Karen absolute authority was deleted unanimously. The day it happened, we burned the old binder in the snow. Slow, deliberate, symbolic. Ash scattered in the same wind that once carried her orders. Then came the media. Reporters wanted quotes, interviews, the man who took down the HOA queen. I declined most of them. This wasn't about me. But one morning, a young journalist showed up at my door, notebook in hand, face flushed from the cold. Mr. Harrington, she said, how did it feel seeing her arrested after everything she did? I thought for a moment. It didn't feel good, I said. It felt necessary. There's a difference. She blinked. Would you call it revenge? No, I said softly. Revenge ends with satisfaction. Justice ends with prevention. Her pencil slowed. Do you believe she learned her lesson? I looked out at the mountain peaks, frost glittering in the morning light. The mountain taught her what no courtroom ever could. That line ended up in the article headline, and it spread like wildfire. By spring, HR 2114 passed committee review. By summer, it entered federal discussion. Porter called to say it had bipartisan traction. A rare miracle, as he put it. If it passed, every HOA in the country would face mandatory audit oversight within 18 months. The same rulebook Karen used to dominate her neighbors would become the document that protected them. That was poetic justice, written in law. But even laws can't heal emotion. Some nights, I still sat by the fire, watching the flames crackle over the same wood I'd chopped months ago. I thought about all the people like Karen, small rulers in small towns, clutching power to fill whatever emptiness lived in them. You can't legislate away arrogance, but you can make it accountable. One evening, a letter arrived from the penitentiary. No return name. But I knew the handwriting instantly. Karen. The lines were shaky, deliberate, controlled. Cole, I suppose you won. The papers say you're fixing the system I broke. Maybe you're right to, maybe not. But know this. Power doesn't disappear. It just changes hands. Don't become what you fought. No apology, no regret, just philosophy from a cell. I folded it, slid it into the fire, and watched it burn. Her words meant nothing without action, and her actions were already buried under snow and statute alike. 2 months later, I stood again before Congress, this time not as witness, but as advisor. The bill passed unanimously. H.R. 2114 became law. A law born from the theft of a woodpile, sealed by frost, and carried to the highest level of justice by a man who refused to stay silent. That night, the mountain wind howled again, but it sounded different, less angry, more alive, like the land itself approved. Karen would serve her time. Iron Creek would live free. And every HOA in the country now had a new name stamped across its bylaws: accountability. The system had been rebuilt, not with vengeance, but with precision. Because justice isn't about burning down corruption. It's about replacing it with light so bright it can't grow back. Snow fell again that winter, slow and deliberate, blanketing Iron Creek in white silence. The kind of silence that only comes after justice has spoken. The mountain didn't roar anymore. It whispered, as if finally satisfied. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking to the sound of imagined footsteps, imagined rules, imagined tyranny. HOA Karen was gone, not just in body, but in influence. Her name had become a warning, not a memory. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I spent that morning stacking a fresh cord of oak beside the cabin. Each log carried its own story, how it was chopped, split, seasoned, and earned through labor. That's how life should work. Effort before comfort. Respect before authority. The sun glowed faint through the snowfall, golden against the horizon. Somewhere, an eagle cried, slicing the cold with its call. Freedom has a sound if you know how to listen for it. The community had changed. The same people who once bowed their heads when Karen drove by now stood tall, laughing again, helping one another shovel driveways, clear roofs, share warmth. They rebuilt their identity the way all strong towns do, through scars, not fear. The HOA no longer existed. In its place stood a simple board of trust, volunteers, not rulers. We didn't call them presidents anymore. We called them neighbors. A month after the new charter, the town held a gathering at the community hall, the same hall where Karen had once berated families for their fence colors and porch decorations. This time, no one wore suits. No one held clipboards. There were kids running between tables, old couples sipping cocoa, and music playing on an old radio that skipped every few bars, but nobody cared. When I walked in, people clapped, not for me, but for what we'd all survived. The mayor approached, handing me a folded parchment. "A small thank you," he said. Inside was a single certificate, Iron Creek Community Service Award, for restoring integrity and peace. I almost laughed. I hadn't done it for an award, but seeing that seal, that symbol of balance restored, hit deeper than I expected. Because justice isn't loud, it's steady. It's the calm that follows chaos. Porter called me that same evening. "Cole, you made national precedent," he said. "3 other states are adopting the new oversight law. You might have just changed how HOA systems operate forever." "Then we did what we set out to do," I told him. "You know," he said, "Karen's appeal was denied this morning. Life without. Parole modification. She'll serve her full 8 years. "Good," I replied quietly. "Maybe solitude will teach her what power never could." He chuckled softly. "You ever think about running for office?" "No," I said. "I'm done chasing titles. I've seen what they do to people who forget what they're for." "Still," he said, "the country could use more people like you." I looked out the window, where snowflakes drifted against the glass. "The country doesn't need more people like me," I said. "It needs fewer people like her." That night, I sat by the fire, the same fireplace that once stood cold because of her greed. The wood hissed and cracked, glowing in shades of amber and gold. I remembered everything: the missing firewood, the snowstorm, her frozen face at my doorstep. Nature had been the first teacher, law the second. Together they'd written a perfect lesson. Arrogance always burns out faster than it thinks. I pulled out my old axe, the handle polished from use, and set it by the door. A reminder of simplicity. The kind of tool that never lies, never schemes, never cheats. It does exactly what it's meant to. Cut clean, stand ready. Weeks turned into months. The mountain thawed, streams melted and ran clear again. Life went back to its rhythm. But even peace has echoes. One spring morning, as I walked the ridge trail, I saw something half buried in the snowmelt, a piece of Karen's old HOA sign. The corner still read, Iron Creek Association, Maintaining Order. The rest was cracked, faded, and warped by the elements. I picked it up, stared for a moment, then tossed it into the rushing creek below. The current carried it away. Fast, final, gone. That's when I realized something. Karen hadn't just stolen firewood that winter. She'd tried to steal warmth itself. The kind of warmth that lives between neighbors, that builds trust, that turns a cold town into a family. But no one can steal that forever, because even in the coldest places, fire always finds its way back. A few months later, I received a letter from Washington, embossed with the HUD seal. It was official recognition. In acknowledgement of your contributions to the establishment of the HOA Transparency and Equity Act. Underneath was a single handwritten note from Porter. You lit a fire that won't go out. I framed it, but not in my cabin. I hung it at the community hall, where everyone could see it, next to the new Iron Creek Charter, signed by every resident in town. The charter didn't begin with, by order of. It began with, we, the neighbors of Iron Creek. And that was enough. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, I took a slow walk down the old HOA road, the same path Karen used to patrol in her SUV. It was quiet now, peaceful. The only sound was the crunch of my boots in the snow and the low hum of the wind. At the bottom of the hill stood the gate. She'd once locked to keep people out. It hung open now, swinging slightly with the breeze, the way it should have been all along. I stopped there, hand resting on the worn metal, and whispered, Order doesn't come from rules. It comes from respect. The wind carried it away, scattering it across the valley like ashes from an old fire finally gone cold. By nightfall, I was back at my cabin, staring into the flames. Justice wasn't supposed to feel warm, but it did, because this time, it wasn't about punishment, it was about balance. The mountain was whole again. So was I. In the distance, I could hear laughter, kids playing, neighbors talking, a community finally breathing free. The kind of sound that reminds you why you fight in the first place. That's the real victory, not seeing your enemy fall, but watching good people rise once they're gone. So when people ask what happened to HOA Karen, I tell them this. She froze, but the town thawed. She fell, but the people stood taller. And somewhere in the echo of every storm, her name serves as a warning. Control doesn't build communities, integrity does. Now every time I light my fire, I think of that winter. I think of the frost, the fear, the fight, and how it all melted into something better. Because at the end of the day, the mountain doesn't remember the storm. It remembers who survived it. And this time, we did.